My son told me he was going to the cemetery to visit his father, so I quietly decided to follow him later with a small bouquet, thinking I would spend a few private moments there too. But when I arrived, the groundskeeper gently stopped me and whispered that I shouldn't go to that grave yet, because I needed to see what my son was really doing, and that warning changed everything. An hour earlier, as the day began, I sat alone in my apartment, a place that still felt more like my late husband Kwame's world than mine, filled wall to wall with his books, his papers, and his presence even after 5 long years. Dust floated through the morning light like it had a life of its own, settling on shelves and furniture I hadn't touched in decades, including my old writing desk by the window that I had abandoned years ago. Today marked exactly 5 years since Kwame passed, and the heaviness of that date always slowed time, making every minute stretch and ache. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, feeling a deep chill that had nothing to do with the room, because I was waiting for my son Jabari and his wife Niara. They always came on this day not truly to remember him, but because the anniversary gave them an excuse to bring up finances again. When the doorbell finally rang, sharp and sudden in the quiet apartment, I knew it was them, and as I stood to answer, I already felt that familiar mix of grief, tension, and unspoken truth pressing down on my chest. Jabari burst into the hallway with an overly cheerful "Hey," his voice trying too hard as he pulled me into a stiff hug, his face rough against my cheek and his expensive cologne barely masking his nervous energy. His wife, Nara, followed close behind, wearing a carefully practiced look of sadness, offering only a quiet nod before drifting into the living room, her eyes instantly scanning the shelves of books she had never respected and often dismissed as worthless clutter. I offered them tea and moved toward the kitchen, already sensing where this visit was heading, but Jabari dropped heavily into his father's old armchair and sighed that tea wouldn't fix their problems. He began talking about how everything was falling apart again, while Nara quickly added details about a shipment stuck at the Charleston port, claiming their goods were worth a fortune and warning that they needed money immediately or they would lose everything. She looked at me directly, calm and calculating, as if measuring what else she could take. Jabari softened his voice and said they hated to trouble me, especially on such a day, but insisted they had no other choice and needed my help. I felt nothing stir inside me, no guilt, no sympathy, only a quiet emptiness shaped by years of the same story. As I looked at my grown son, his face tight with frustration and entitlement, I struggled to see the child I once held, realizing how far away that boy truly was. "I'll think about it, Jabari," I said softly, telling him I needed time to look over my finances, and the disappointment on his face was instant, sharp, and poorly hidden. Nara shot him a tense look because they had clearly expected an easy yes, the kind that comes from unconditional love without questions. Jabari then walked to the window, clasping his hands behind his back in a way meant to copy his father, though it lacked the quiet strength his father once carried. After a pause, he turned toward me with damp eyes and a shaking voice, saying it had been 5 years since his father passed and that the loss still felt fresh, that he needed to go to the cemetery alone to speak to him and clear his heart. I recognized the performance immediately, a tactic he had used since childhood, but despite that, something fragile inside me stirred. For a brief moment, I wanted to believe there was still honesty in him, that his father's memory meant more than words. That hope softened my judgment, and I encouraged him gently, my voice unsteady with emotion. He nodded quickly, wiped his face, and hurried out as if afraid I might change my mind. Nara lingered just long enough to reinforce the story, quietly praising his sensitivity before leaving, and I was left alone with my thoughts, wondering whether I had just been moved by truth or by habit. That I stood there alone in the heavy silence, broken only by the steady ticking of the clock, and that small, fragile hope inside me began to grow stronger. I felt an overwhelming urge to see my son at his father's resting place, not to question him or test his honesty, but simply to believe that grief had brought us together again, even briefly. Acting on that feeling, I changed quickly and took 3 deep red carnations from the vase, the same flowers I had bought that morning for my husband's portrait, and quietly called a cab to a nearby street so I wouldn't be noticed. During the ride, I imagined myself standing at a distance watching my son alone, head lowered, lost in memory, and I told myself that if I saw that, I might finally find the strength to help him one last time. Pine Ridge Cemetery welcomed me with its calm air and the soft sound of trees moving in the breeze, and as I walked along the familiar gravel path toward our family resting place, my heart beat fast with nervous hope. Just as the stone gates came into view, the groundskeeper Ephraim appeared and walked straight toward me, his serious expression instantly cooling my optimism. When he gently stopped me and quietly asked me not to go any further, telling me I needed to see what my son was truly doing, his words landed heavily, draining the warmth from my chest, and without speaking I simply nodded, realizing something important was about to change. That I didn't ask him to explain, and I didn't question his words, because deep down I already knew the truth would hurt more than silence. He turned and walked away from the main path, guiding me along a narrow trail swallowed by weeds, and I followed him almost without thinking, as if my body had decided before my mind could catch up. We didn't speak at all, and the quiet was filled only with dry leaves crunching underfoot and the distant call of a bird somewhere overhead. He stopped near a small rise by an old leaning fence surrounding a forgotten grave, and from there, through tangled branches, I could clearly see our family resting place standing dark and solid in the distance. Ephraim softly told me that from here I could see everything while remaining unseen, then stepped away, giving me the space to face whatever was coming on my own. Holding the cold fence for support, I waited only a few minutes before my son appeared, not alone as he claimed, but walking briskly beside his wife, both empty-handed and without a trace of sorrow in their steps. They didn't pause or hesitate, and when he unlocked the heavy door and they entered as if it were an ordinary room, not a sacred place, a heavy realization settled inside me, growing stronger when another stranger arrived and quietly joined them, confirming that my son had not come to remember his father at all. Then I noticed movement that made my breath catch as Jabari and Niara stepped back out, each holding something wrapped tightly in dark fabric, one long and narrow, the other square and heavy-looking. They passed the bundles to the stranger with hurried hands, glancing around as if afraid the stones themselves might be watching, and that alone told me this was something shameful. The quiet air carried pieces of their low conversation, and I heard the man praise the work, saying even an expert wouldn't notice the difference, while my son spoke with proud confidence about quality and planning, and Niara pressed eagerly about museum contacts and paperwork. In that instant, the last trace of warmth I had carried for decades disappeared without warning, not slowly but all at once, leaving behind a hard, painful clarity that felt heavier than anger. I understood then that this wasn't desperation or a mistake, but a deliberate act that crossed every line of respect and decency my husband had lived by. They had used his resting place as cover for lies and deception, twisting everything he stood for into something ugly, and that realization settled deep in me, silent and final. I didn't cry or gasp or move, because some truths don't shock you outwardly, they simply settle inside and change who you are forever. While the stranger took the packages and vanished as quietly as he had arrived, Jabari and Niara took one last look inside the crypt, adjusted something quickly, then shut and locked the heavy door with the same harsh scraping sound, leaving without placing even a single flower in respect. I don't remember saying goodbye to Ephraim. I think I only gave a small nod and walked past him, and his silence felt like a quiet kindness I didn't have the strength to face. I moved through the cemetery paths without really seeing the markers or statues, left through the gates, got into a car and gave my address as if on autopilot, staring out the window the entire ride while the world blurred past like it belonged to someone else. When I entered the apartment, the familiar scent of old books, paper and my husband's tobacco wrapped around me, and for the first time it felt like a museum rather than a home. I walked through the living room slowly, past his desk, his chair, and the shelves filled with his life's work, and suddenly it all felt staged, impressive but lifeless. My eyes settled on my small writing desk by the window, long ignored and coated in dust, and with deliberate calm I opened the lowest drawer and pulled out a plain wooden box. The small key I had worn for decades fit perfectly, and inside lay my old tools, untouched by time, along with the reference books I had once built my career on. When I lifted the magnifying lens and held it to my eye, the sharp clarity felt familiar and grounding, and in that moment I understood that the part of me I had buried for 30 years was not gone, only waiting. For 30 years, my life had been defined by other roles, first as a wife, then a mother, then a widow guarding someone else's legacy, but at the cemetery something quietly ended and something long asleep inside me began to stir. I closed the box with care and left the dust on the desk untouched, knowing that tomorrow I would restore things in my own way, on my own terms. That night passed without sleep, not because of anger or plans for revenge, but because I sat calmly in the armchair, looking at the toolbox and letting a clear, steady resolve settle in me. At dawn, I felt no rush and no heaviness, only focus, so I took water and a cloth and began cleaning my corner for the first time in years, revealing the worn wood of the desk and tending to my plants with quiet attention. I wiped the glass of the small shelf that held my own books, modest works I had written long before marriage, and seeing my name, Eva Jones, printed there felt like meeting a forgotten part of myself. I left the rest of the apartment untouched, a preserved memory of another life, while my small space by the window became clean, bright, and purposeful, ready for what came next. When the doorbell rang exactly at noon, it wasn't gentle or emotional anymore, but sharp and impatient, and they entered without waiting as if certain of their place. Jabari didn't move to greet me and his face looked tight with impatience, while Nara barely hid her irritation, making it clear they were here for one reason only. "Did you decide?" Jabari asked the moment he stepped inside, already walking toward the living room, and I calmly suggested tea first, which earned them an annoyed look but no refusal. They sat down, Jabari sinking into his father's chair out of habit, Nara perching on the edge of the sofa as if ready to leave at any second, while I prepared the tea slowly and carefully, listening to their hushed whispers about me delaying the inevitable. When I returned and set the cups down, I chose a different chair than usual and poured the tea with steady hands, letting the quiet stretch as Jabari drummed his fingers and Nara avoided drinking. He finally broke the silence, saying they needed an answer today and couldn't afford delays, but I simply took a sip and looked at them with calm distance as though meeting clients, not family. Then I gently asked whether his current work had anything to do with antiques or rare items, speaking lightly, almost absent-mindedly, and the effect was instant. Jabari stiffened, his fingers stopping mid-tap, and the room went still before he let out a loud, forced laugh, the kind that comes when someone is caught off guard and trying to recover control. His laugh wasn't warm or friendly. It carried a sharp edge, the kind people use when they believe they're far above the conversation. He told me not to bother them with old interests and spoke slowly, as if explaining something obvious, insisting they were dealing with serious business I couldn't possibly understand. Niara didn't laugh at all. She smiled with polite pity and briefly touched my hand, suggesting I focus on my health and leave important matters to them, then quickly shifted the talk back to money and said it was time to go. They both stared at me, certain they were in control, seeing only a quiet older woman who would eventually give in. They mistook my calm for weakness and my silence for confusion, unaware that their confidence was giving me exactly what I needed. As I watched their impatience grow, something inside me settled and sharpened, and when I gently set my cup down and agreed in a tired, even voice, the visible relief on their faces told me they truly believed they had won. Niara allowed herself a brief, triumphant smile and said, "I will need to review my assets." Jabari immediately sat up straighter, nodding eagerly. Of course. Check the accounts, call the bank if you need to, we can wait for an hour." "No," I replied firmly. "I'll do it myself. I need time." I stood, signaling that the conversation was over. They left, tossing instructions over their shoulders about which bank to contact, which account to access, and how to make the transfer without raising questions. I nodded silently, escorting them to the door. When it clicked shut behind them, I lingered for a moment in the hush that followed, letting their words echo. What could you possibly know? They had misjudged me. They hadn't just underestimated me, they had forgotten who I was. And I was just beginning to remember. I didn't wait until evening. Picking up the phone, I rifled through an old address book and dialed the direct line to the lodge at Pine Ridge Cemetery. Rings stretched long enough for me to doubt anyone would answer, until a low, familiar voice broke the quiet. "Hello. Ephraim, it's Eva Jones," I said, my voice calm, steady, businesslike, the voice I hadn't used in 30 years. "I need to get into the crypt tonight. Can you help me?" A pause, not of shock but of measured thought. "Yes," he replied finally. "What time?" "When the gates are closed. No one will be here." "Good. Side gate. 3 hours." He hung up and I set the phone down. That was it. The first step had been taken. Night descended quickly over the city. I dressed entirely in black, taking only a toolbox wrapped in an old shawl and a small, powerful flashlight. A cab brought me to the next street. The cemetery at night was a different world. By day, a place of quiet sorrow. By night, a tense, ringing silence. Moonlight sliced through bare branches, casting skeletal shadows across the paths. By the side gate, as promised, Ephraim waited, blending with the brick wall like a living shadow. Silently he unlocked the gate, let me in, and locked it again behind us. We walked the empty paths together. I felt no fear. Strangely, among the dead, I felt more alive than I had in years within the museum-like stillness of my apartment. The Johnson crypt loomed ahead, vast and alien in the moonlight. Ephraim drew a set of keys from his pocket, not the ordinary ones Jabari had given me, but his own trusted tools. He didn't rush, pausing as if to honor the moment. His face, half in shadow, carried solemnity and a profound sadness. "Miss Jones," he said quietly, his voice threaded with long-standing respect, "your husband, Wami Johnson, he was more than just a man to me. Years ago, when my family had nothing and the street was all we knew, he was the only one who reached out a hand. He had paid for my education at Morehouse College in the history department, and in so many ways he had saved us. Everything I have today is because of him." Ephraim paused, swallowing hard, and then said, "I've been watching your son for 6 months and I couldn't stand what I saw. He treated his father's grave with disrespect, using it like it meant nothing. At first I thought it might just be careless behavior, but then I listened carefully and started taking notes." From his coat he pulled out a small worn notebook with a dark cover and handed it to me. "Everything is here," he said. "Dates, meetings, car plates, fragments of conversations I overheard. I did it for him to honor his memory. I didn't know what to do with it until you came yesterday. I took it then." The notebook felt heavy in my hands, not because of the paper but because of the betrayal it recorded. I didn't open it right away, only held it tight. "Thank you, Ephraim," I said softly, and in his quiet nod, I felt more trust and understanding than I had in years. He then guided me to the crypt, inserted a key, and the metal ground loudly before the door finally swung open, letting out a musty, centuries-old scent. "The spot is here," he said, pointing to a marble slab beside the sarcophagus. It looked like any other, but he showed me 2 subtle indentations at the bottom. "Press them together and it moves." He handed me the heavy key and said, "Lock yourself inside. I'll stay close, and when you're done just open the door, I'll hear it." Then he vanished into the shadows. Alone, I turned the key in the lock and the click echoed in the cold space. I switched on the flashlight, illuminating the dusty, forgotten sarcophagus. Following Ephraim's instructions, I pressed the indentations and the slab shifted easily, revealing a hidden niche. Inside, neatly arranged on dark crimson velvet, were several objects. I carefully took the largest, placed it on the sarcophagus lid and unwrapped it. It was an old wooden icon, ancient and sacred. The Savior, crafted not by human hands, staring back at me with a presence that felt both powerful and eternal. The icon's face was breathtaking, every detail painted with incredible skill, and the eyes carried a deep, sorrowful calm that seemed to forgive everything. The golden background reflected the flashlight faintly, dulled by time, and the varnish had darkened, forming a delicate network of cracks. Small chips in the wood only confirmed its authenticity, a true masterpiece worthy of a museum. I set my toolbox beside it and opened it, my hands immediately finding the familiar tools. Picking up the loop, I examined the icon, my eye, mind, and memory working together as if the 30 years I had been away never existed. I studied every inch. The brush strokes, the texture of the ground revealed in the tiny chips, and the method used to secure the splines on the back. Everything was flawless, or almost flawless. I switched on the UV lamp, and the old varnish glowed yellow-green as expected. But as I scanned the folds of the Savior's robe where lead white had been used for highlights, a subtle difference appeared. A brighter, colder, chalky glow that shouldn't have been there. Titanium dioxide in its anatase form, a pigment not patented until the early 20th century, revealed a tiny but telling error. Whoever created this had been audacious, confident that no one would notice. In that instant I remembered the name clearly. Anatol Voronov, the master restorer expelled from the National Institute of Expertise for unethical copying experiments, obsessed with perfect fakes. I knew the forger and exactly what I needed to do next. Gently I placed the icon back in its velvet wrapping, folded my tools into the box and returned everything to the hidden niche. I turned the key and the heavy crypt door creaked open, letting in a thin slice of night sky and a rush of cold air. Ephraim stood at the entrance like a silent sentinel, waiting without a word. I handed him both keys and he took them with a simple nod, understanding everything without needing to speak. He moved ahead, his shadow sliding over the stone floor, guiding me toward the exit. The ride home passed in a haze. The city was waking up. A few cars rushed by, workers swept the sidewalks, and I sat in the cab, gripping Ephraim's worn notebook. The resolve I had felt the day before, up on the hill by the old fence, solidified inside me. Not anger, but a calm, precise determination, like a surgeon preparing for a difficult but necessary procedure. I didn't call the police. That would only address the surface, not the lie they had built or the web they had spun for years. To restore what had been desecrated, I had to strike at the heart of the deception itself. Back at the apartment, I didn't rest. I brewed strong black coffee and sat at my tidy desk as the first rays of sunlight crept through the window. Yesterday had ended. Today was the day for action. On the desk lay an old telephone directory I hadn't touched in years. I found the number I needed: Paul K. Stevens, director of the Atlanta Museum of Art. I remembered him as a young, eager graduate student who had once admired Kwame's work with quiet awe. My fingers were steady as I dialed. A cheerful woman answered in the director's office. I asked to speak with Mr. Stevens about an urgent matter. He paused, asking what it concerned. I replied firmly, Eva Johnson Jones, the wife of the late Kwame Johnson. There was a moment of hesitation, then a change in her tone, respectful now. "One moment, please," she said. I waited, listening to the steady tick of the wall clock, knowing the first step of the plan had begun. The seconds ticked by like a countdown to a life I thought I had left behind. "Eva Johnson Jones," Paul Stevens said, his voice just as I remembered, deep, smooth, tinged with that familiar self-satisfaction. "What a surprise. It's been so long. Please accept my condolences for your loss. Kwame was a beacon for all of us." Polite words, empty of meaning, carefully designed to make me speak first, to plead or reminisce. "Paul, hello," I said evenly. "I'm calling not just as Kwame Johnson's widow, but as a former senior archivist at the National Institute of Expertise." Silence followed, short but telling. "I'm listening, Eva," he said, and the velvet condescension had vanished, replaced by weariness. "I understand your museum is planning to acquire a rare 15th-century psalter, from a private collection if I'm correct." Another silence. He hadn't expected that. "That information is internal," he finally said, cautious. "How do you know this?" "The source doesn't matter," I replied steadily. "What matters is this: you're being deceived. The psalter you're about to buy is a high-quality forgery." Outrage rose in his voice. "But our experts, preliminary tests, everything was confirmed." "They weren't looking closely enough," I said. "I suspect the white pigment in the initials contains the anatase form of titanium dioxide, which didn't exist in the 15th century. Check it and you'll see for yourself." I heard the certainty in my own voice, the voice of Jones the expert, not just Eva the widow or mother. Stevens was silent. I could feel the wheels turning in his mind. Scandal, reputation ruined, potential loss of funding. "Titanium dioxide," he muttered, a whisper of disbelief. "But who could do such a thing?" I delivered the final strike calmly. "You know who, Paul? Remember the man expelled from the Institute 2 decades ago for misusing copies? Anatol Voronov. You thought he disappeared, perhaps drank himself to death, but his talent has found a new purpose." The name landed like a shock, and I heard the shift in his tone, the recognition of a danger long underestimated. "Paul, I strongly advise you to stop the deal right now and order a full, independent examination before it's too late," I said firmly. Yes, of course," he replied quickly, his confidence gone. "I owe you greatly. I'll cancel everything at once. We should meet." I cut him off gently but decisively. "First, take care of what must be done. Goodbye." I ended the call, and the apartment fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt alive, tight with expectation rather than heavy. I knew that at that very moment phones were ringing in the museum, urgent instructions were being passed, and a nearly finalized agreement was being torn apart. I imagined the shock when the buyers called, the confusion and fear as plans unraveled and promised money disappeared overnight. I walked to the window as dawn began to break, calm and steady. Their easy path was gone, and the people waiting for their money would not be patient. The clock continued to tick, no longer marking my past, but counting toward an inevitable reckoning, and I chose to wait calmly at my chosen ground. 2 long days passed in thick, uneasy quiet. No calls, no visits, just silence that I recognized as a pause before impact. They were scrambling, trying to understand what failed, searching for ways to recover, but the main support of their plan had already been removed. During those days I stayed busy. With Ephraim's help, who came by under the excuse of fixing a small household issue, I reshaped my space. We moved my husband's heavy desk aside, no longer the heart of the room, just another piece of furniture. In its place I set up my own writing desk, simple, clean and ready. I brought out my books, long ignored but deeply familiar, spreading them around me. Using Ephraim's notebook, I carefully wrote down names, dates and numbers, organizing them on large sheets of paper until a clear picture formed. A detailed outline of their hidden activities finally laid bare. For the first time in many years, the apartment no longer felt like a place frozen in time and grief. It finally looked like a working space, my working space. On the third day they arrived and I knew it was them even before they made themselves heard. It wasn't a polite knock but a loud, angry pounding that shook the door. I stayed calm, set my pen down neatly, closed the notebook and walked to the door without haste. The pounding grew stronger and Jabari's voice broke through, sharp and furious, demanding that I open up because he knew I was inside. When I turned the key, the door swung open hard against the wall and they rushed in, tense and shaken. Fear and anger were written clearly on their faces, with none of the polite masks they had worn before. Jabari stormed toward me, shouting that the deal had collapsed, the buyer had vanished and everything had fallen apart because of me. His voice was loud and wild, but I didn't react the way I once would have. Instead of shrinking back, I simply watched him calmly, steady and composed. I turned away, walked back into the living room, sat at my desk and picked up my pen as if he weren't there. He followed, still yelling, demanding my attention, but I quietly noted another license plate number from Ephraim's notebook. Without looking up, I asked in a calm, even voice whether I had truly ruined them or simply revealed the truth. The room went quiet for a moment as my words settled in. I continued writing, explaining softly that my past experience and contacts were far more valuable than they ever imagined. When I finally raised my eyes and looked at them both, I saw the change instantly, confusion turning into realization, and realization giving way to fear as they understood exactly how much I knew and how carefully everything had been recorded. They looked at me and no longer saw a quiet, fragile mother or someone meant to fade into the background of their lives. Instead, they saw a woman seated firmly at her desk in the center of the room, upright and steady, with a calm, sharp focus that left no room for argument. What stood before them was Ava Jones, the archivist they had dismissed and forgotten decades ago. Jabari stepped back, his anger dissolving into pure fear as the truth settled in, and he whispered that I was the one who contacted the museum. I didn't argue or raise my voice. I simply stated the facts, telling him plainly that he had turned his father's resting place into a storage space and used his name for dishonest gain. There was no emotion in my words, only certainty, and the silence that followed made them heavier than shouting ever could. Jabari stood frozen, unable to speak, searching for support that never came. Niara, however, recovered quickly, her fear replaced by cold calculation as she pulled him toward the door, dismissing me with sharp words meant to hide her panic. Before leaving, she turned back and fixed me with a hard stare that made her intentions clear. This was not finished. After they were gone, I stayed at my desk, fully aware that Niara would not stop easily. I knew she would try again, and exactly 2 days later, that expectation proved true when my neighbor Ms. Anime called me. Her voice shook with anger as she called me. "Eva, did you see tonight's Gossip Hound? Sit down before you read it." I didn't usually touch tabloids, but I went to the corner store and bought a copy. On page 3, under a sensational headline, "Widow's Grief or Senior Insanity," was my photo taken almost 10 years ago at an anniversary. Beside it, Jabari and Niara smiled in staged, sympathetic poses. The article twisted every fact, claiming I had lost touch with reality, invented lies to tarnish my children, and maybe even colluded with criminals. The final line was cruelest of all, suggesting I myself might be running a criminal ring to eliminate rivals or soothe my conscience. Their plan was clear: make me appear old, lonely, and untrustworthy so no one would believe me over a young, successful couple. I finished the article, folded the paper, and felt nothing. No anger, only icy contempt. They thought they were clever, but in truth they had exposed themselves. I picked up the phone and called Paul Stevens. His voice answered promptly, calm yet sharp. "Museum director speaking." I said, Paul, it's Eva Jones. Did you see tonight's Gossip Hound? A heavy sigh came from the other end. I did, Eva. What garbage. I was just about to call you. When he mentioned lawyers, I cut him off immediately. No need for lawyers. I have a better plan. It's time the museum announces its new acquisition. Not the Salter, but something far more important. An hour later, I was sitting in the director's office, Ephraim's notebook open on the table. Paul Stevens, the security chief, and I leaned over it as I calmly went through every entry, dates, license plates, meetings, showing the connections in my diagram. I explained the chemical makeup of the pigments, the methods used to age the wood artificially, and even how the watermarks had been forged. They listened in silence, their expressions growing serious. The director's earlier condescension had vanished, replaced by professional respect and the excitement of realizing a major discovery was at hand. They declared war, Paul said, closing the notebook. They'll get their answer. Tomorrow at 11 a.m., the press conference will be in the museum's main hall. The next day the room was packed with journalists, cameras flashing, a buzzing energy of anticipation. I sat in the front row, Ephraim beside me in a plain but neat suit, calm and steady. Paul approached the podium looking every bit the authority figure. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending. Today marks an important step in preserving cultural heritage, he said. Pausing for effect, he continued, we are introducing a new role at the museum, Special Consultant for Antiquities and Authenticity. It is my great honor to present the person who will fill this position, a professional whose name stands for unmatched expertise, integrity, and dedication in the field. Please welcome Eva Johnson. He turned toward me, and for a brief moment the room fell completely silent. A few hesitant claps started, but most journalists exchanged puzzled glances. Even the author of yesterday's Gossip Hound article froze, pen dropping onto the floor. I rose and walked steadily to the podium, taking in the bright flashes, the rows of cameras and dozens of curious eyes. I spoke clearly and confidently without notes, explaining the differences in varnish under ultraviolet light and how titanium dioxide could reveal a forgery. I did not speak as a widow or a victim. I spoke as a professional, methodically laying out the facts. The hall went utterly quiet, everyone listening intently. At the end, I introduced Ephraim, the man whose courage and loyalty to my late husband's memory had prevented a major theft. Ephraim stepped forward, placing his worn notebook on the podium. I only did what was right, he said softly but firmly. At that very moment, on the other side of the city, 2 unmarked cars arrived at my son and daughter-in-law's home. They had just finished packing when detectives used a master key to enter. By the time the press conference ended, Paul's assistant quietly whispered, "Miss Jones, they've been caught while trying to escape." I heard the words without a flicker of triumph. No joy, no satisfaction, only a long, heavy silence that followed the chaos. I nodded slowly, accepting the news as the natural outcome of careful planning and truth prevailing. Paul stepped between me and the journalists, speaking firmly, "That concludes today's announcement, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you." His voice carried the weight of finality, deliberate and commanding, leaving no room for questions or doubt. He took my arm and, ignoring the murmurs around us, guided me through the service exit, away from the chaos. From that day forward, my life didn't just change, it truly began. The first thing I did when I returned home was fling open all the windows, letting in sunlight and fresh air that had been blocked for decades. I removed the heavy, dusty drapes, and suddenly the apartment didn't feel gloomy or oppressive. The dust floating in the sunbeams no longer seemed like a symbol of decay, it was simply dust waiting to be wiped away. The apartment transformed before my eyes. It was no longer a shrine to a single great man, it became a living workspace for me. Wayne's books remained on the shelves, but now mine shared the space proudly. His desk stayed against the wall as a tribute, now adorned with a vase of fresh flowers instead of piles of manuscripts. And my own writing desk took the center of the room, alive with papers, printouts, and photographs of antiques sent from across the country. The air smelled of lemon polish, coffee, and the fresh ink of catalogs, no longer tobacco or neglect. The sharp ring of the phone broke the quiet. I picked it up without looking away from the photograph of an enameled locket I was examining with my loupe. "Jones. Oh, Ms. Jones. This is Legacy Auction House. We're calling about that Faber cigarette case. We have full documentation confirming its provenance." I chuckled quietly. Paperwork is always the easiest part to fake. And the hallmark? I asked. Absolutely perfect, the young man replied. I pushed the photograph aside and spoke calmly, firmly. Carl Fabre had an apprentice at the time with a slight vision defect. He always set the hallmark slightly off, tilted just a fraction of a millimeter to the right. Yours is set perfectly straight as if measured with a ruler, I said, examining the piece carefully. It's modern work based on old sketches. Impressive but still modern. The provenance is fake. Tell your client that plainly. Silence fell on the other end of the line. I hung up, picked up my loupe and returned to my work as I had for decades. Twice a week I led seminars at the museum, teaching young curators and art history students. I stood in the bright, spacious hall, facing a dozen eager faces and spoke with calm authority, not as an old widow, but as someone who had spent a lifetime uncovering the truth in objects. Never trust first impressions, I told them, holding an ancient reliquary. Beauty can lie. History can lie. Even science can be used to lie. But the object itself never lies, you just have to learn to hear it. I pointed to a scrollwork pattern. See how the light reflects on this patina? Too even. Real-time leaves scars where traces of human hands. This is the work of a chemist, not time. Their eyes shone with curiosity and I felt it. The real legacy of my life was here in passing on knowledge, sparking their love for authenticity, just as Wayne had once sparked it in me. After the seminar I didn't go straight home. The day was warm and bright, so I bought a bouquet of white lilies and drove to Pine Ridge Cemetery. Everything looked different now. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, shadows offered cool shade instead of fear. I walked along the familiar path, feeling calm and at peace. When I reached our crypt, the granite door stood closed for good. Inside everything was in order. No hidden compartments, no foreign objects, only tranquility. I placed the lilies gently on the stone, and for the first time in many years, I felt complete quiet and closure. The white lilies stood out brilliantly against the dark granite as I traced my fingers over the engraved letters. Quaim Johnson. The sharp pain I had carried for so many years was gone, replaced by a quiet sadness and deep gratitude. Well, Quaim, I whispered, everything is as it should be now. I lingered a moment longer, breathing in the scent of flowers and the earthy aroma of fallen leaves. I was not here as a grieving widow, but as a woman who had reclaimed her dignity, her name, and her future. Turning to leave, I saw Ephraim in the distance, sweeping the driveway. He spotted me, paused, and gave a single solemn nod. I returned it. Our silent salute, a quiet acknowledgement between two guardians of memory. The sun warmed my back as I walked toward the exit, no longer a shadow of my husband or defined by the failings of my son. I was Eva Jones, free at last, my life restored. My story is one of betrayal but also of inner strength. A reminder that even tools left untouched for years can regain their power. I found the courage not just to hold the guilty accountable but to rebuild my life completely, honoring my husband's legacy and my own worth. The choices I made were difficult. Did I do the right thing by turning my son over to justice? Was it revenge or the only way to protect what mattered most? Could I have forgiven or chosen another path? And what came next for Eva Jones? Her new career, her life after the storm, and whether Jabari ever tried to reach her. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your questions or reflections in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from and don't forget to like this video if it moved you. Subscribe to the channel to follow more true life stories, and consider supporting us with a super thanks so we can continue bringing these tales to life. On screen you'll find 2 more stories I highly recommend. Thank you for your support and I look forward to reading your comments. See you in the next story with respect and gratitude.